But I was having the thought, I guess really the more abstract and I think interesting question here is if we assume that the common language between humans and agents is code, does it actually make far more sense to just assume that everything is going to be code? At some point,
Yeah.
all communication channel like arrives back at some, like you're saying, some set of ones and zeros that we can
Yeah.
interconnect with.
Yeah. Cool.
Welcome back to the ScholarAI Founders Pod. Quick reminder to catch us on your favorite podcast locations and find us on our YouTube channel. Today we're talking major updates in tech, new model releases in AI, and much more. Lekshay, starting with you. I know you got some topics to kick us off, so why don't you jump in?
Yeah, so this is fairly interesting, and potentially a really, really big development, potentially just a lot of hype garnering. But I don't know if you saw this, Damon, but maybe Tuesday of this week, OpenAI announced that they are going to acquire IO. IO is a hardware design company that is spearheaded by the person who basically like envisioned the Mac, the Apple Watch, the iPhone, like one of the like lead designers. It's a team of like 55 something Apple engineers. And OpenAI has even been putting promotional content out about their collaboration. Like OpenAI has done formal marketing saying like we now work with IO um, with the full intent of making devices. Premise being AI needs a new like type form, like whatever that is. We're going to be building that and releasing it to the world. Is that real? Is this something that's going to actually like functionalize soon? We don't know. But the suddenness of it was really, really expected. So I know you haven't been exposed to this news yet. I would just love to hear your gut reaction off the rip.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, basically, I've heard the headlines of acquisition is happening and then nothing
Mm-hmm.
more. And so I think to me, this sparks two thoughts related, but I think independent of one another. And the first is to me, this very clearly signals that robotics as a particular sector under the hardware thing is happening. OpenAI is aware of that and they need to bolster their talent there. OpenAI strikes me as maybe world-class software. As of my knowledge, they don't really have much hardware expertise under their kind of umbrella. So I think it makes a lot of sense, independent of, the thing that I will say next, to do this, to kind of move in this direction. Because I do think that we will see various forms of automation becoming everyday items. I don't know if we're talking about 2 years or 10 years, but I certainly think that, various types of robots are coming, probably first in the manufacturing sector, right? Putting together cars, doing dangerous jobs that humans, hopefully shouldn't be doing anyway. And then maybe into homes if you believe in kind of the vision that Tesla and Optimus and others are kind of pitching. The other interesting thing I think in this is the opportunity that OpenAI is signaling that they see with this acquisition, which is a possible new form factor that is a better conduit for interacting with AI than the things that we have right now,
Mm-hmm.
namely the smartphone, laptop, even tablet to some degree. That to me is still very much unproven. But again, I think it makes sense from a business perspective for OpenAI to be kind of metaphorically placing some chips on that bet, right? They want to have the expertise in house. If there is going to be some other, um, you know, form and function for an AI interface, whether that is, I guess the one I left out is uh, glasses, right? Kind of
Mm-hmm.
the like the Ray-Ban Meta collaboration, I think is also interesting. I do think it makes sense for OpenAI to try to play in that space because I think you can draw a pretty clear line between the advantage of, say, the Apple App Store and the placement that is the iPhone. Like, I don't think you get the App Store without the iPhone. And so,
Mm-hmm.
in that kind of analogy, I think that in some ways it's probably insurance for OpenAI to say if there is going to be a new device or similar that's going to dominate public consumption, public use of AI, we want that thing to be pointed at our large language model or whatever our
Right.
AI is, right? And not somebody else's. So,
Yeah, I think listening to what the announcement was saying, it's hard for like they obviously kind of allude to like we need new design, we need like new ways of thinking around like what an AI first world has. But it does also read to me as just like part of this is like they don't want to be guarded in the ecosystem of existing phone providers. Like they don't want to be in the ecosystem of like Apple, Google controlling their entire platform. We've seen stuff like that where like Google and Apple have both had like monopoly levied stuff against them. And this is like at the most simplest form, like outside of any aspiration to like make a new type form or whatever, it feels like the beginning of like OpenAI wanting more liberal control over the device ecosystem because their models, their vision, their like generation is already really, really good. Google is continuing to progress in like a pretty significant way on making their devices AI native. Apple's not so much. And OpenAI sees an opportunity to become a player. Like it feels like almost like a little bit of a challenge at Apple, if anything.
Do you think you would buy a iPhone equivalent that was built from the ground up for AI? Like, is the smartphone use of AI compelling enough to make you think about an alternative?
I think it depends on what it does. I feel like a lot of this like AI agentic stuff is so aspirational generally. That's like a background computer that does stuff behind the scenes and automates work or whatever. But right now, in most functional capacities, it's just I prompt, I get result, right? It's fundamentally an app. It's not a system, right?
Yep.
And if they were to actually figure out like an operating system that is AI first, then the conversation is very different, right? If I get an email and all of a sudden like it's being processed in a more intelligent way that does much more stuff and like is integrated cross device, and I'm not having to like check notifications, reply. The nature of what a phone is switches. It makes sense to me why they'd want to be controlling the OS and the kernel of a device that's functional in that way, right?
Mhm.
As to whether they reach that, I don't know. Like that's like
Yeah.
a very different conversation about like what's their aspiration, where they're actually trying to take things. I know there's a lot of people who are quite skeptical about this. Like OpenAI also did a acquisition of like a search backend like system a while ago. They did an acquisition of this team, and then I know there's some skeptics who are like this team had no product, no roadmap, just like a fluffy design page. So there's not like actually a thing here, and this is just like a flashy acquisition for an overvalued price. So there's a lot of people who are skeptical that there's even anything coming of it. But I found that OpenAI in general, like they're expanding so much, like their team size is just growing and growing every single day, that they're at least going to take like an earnest shot at it. Like on the robotics thing, like they have this interesting relationship with the startup ecosystem in general and their own internal development, where robotics is something that they fund quite a bit, while also clearly building towards those use cases.
Well, I think they're in a unique position in a brand new ecosystem in that the majority of developers who are using AI are doing so, at least in part, via the OpenAI API.
Mm-hmm.
And so they do get access to some amount of data. How much, I guess it's kind of anybody's guess, but they do know what kind of the most compelling use cases are, right? And they do know which applications or which things are eating up the most tokens, on
Yeah.
their system and that kind of thing. And so I do think from that view, again, they're placing speculative bets here, and thinking about it from that perspective, I also think that a new consumer hardware device is possible, even if not probable. And at the numbers that OpenAI, has access to as far as the amount of capital, they've had talks about maybe going public in the relatively near future, and just recently closed a big round with SoftBank and et cetera. And so I think that it makes sense even to just diversify, kind of again under the analogy of insurance, even if
Yeah.
you kind of, think it's a 10 or a 15% probability
Yeah.
that we can replace the smartphone. That's a bet worth taking when you are
Yeah.
OpenAI.
Yeah. Another IO that happened is Google had their conference. Did you get a chance to look at any of that stuff or no?
Not really.
No.
No, I've been playing with some of the newest models, but short of that, I'm in the dark.
They just had some model announcements. I didn't check the benchmarks really. Like the Google one kind of went under the hood because it felt like a lot of application layer stuff to me.
Yeah.
But it was really interesting application layer stuff. They announced like, so obviously with Notebook LM, I think they're kind of realizing the way for them to kind of go is the generation of novel material. So their apps like Notebook LM had its big moment when you could turn material into podcasts. So they're just kind of doing more of like material into note cards, like tutorials, like video generation, that sort of thing. As to how prominent it's going to get, like how wide reaching it'll really be, we'll see. But was interesting because it does seem like, at least in like the common opinion, is that Google's finding their footing with developers a little bit, with consumers a little bit, outside of just like the search blurbs that enhance your results, which is new, but we'll see if that actually ends up going anywhere. I'm skeptical still because it doesn't seem to have market reach yet.
Yeah. My opinion of Google is fairly multifaceted in this front. Number one, I think from just like a pure stock picking perspective, it's kind of undervalued. Like I think that everyone is kind of on pause on Google just because they're not exactly sure how much AI is going to erode search.
Mhm.
And there are indicators that says, Google's dominance in search is dropping, but then they'll also kind of counter, and we talked about this not long ago, that their kind of profit numbers are telling a different story. People don't really know what to believe right now. They are kind of facing the classic innovator's dilemma in that anything novel and new and kind of really compelling they do in AI does run risk of disrupting their core business, which is the monetization of search. I mean, you could argue that Google hasn't been best in search in the purest form, just returning the most relevant links in a very long
Mhm.
time because they've monetized that search product. And that's totally fine. But I think whether it's the Gemini workspace, whether it is Notebook LM, no matter what kind of it is, I think fundamentally there is probably, I'm speculating here, internal friction
Mhm.
at the company between teams whose primary metric might be generate clicks and
Yeah.
cash in search and generate clicks and cash in this new AI umbrella, whatever that might be. And so I do think watching them navigate this has been interesting. I think it's also notable and speaks to kind of the compelling moment that we're in where Sergey Brin and others are going back to Google to step in to take more of a hands-on approach, that kind of
Mhm.
thing. I think is very in a way that is probably again unique to the emergence of AI, and then also maybe a little bit of a canary in the coal mine to say they realize this is Google's inflection point as well.
Yeah. It is interesting. I mean, they announced at I/O some systems around like almost so in the same way that we have like agentic like reservation makers or agentic like ticket booking systems, like those are fairly not solved systems, but like they get a good amount of traffic in like the developer space of like I'm making an agent that manages your reservations for you. I'm making an agent that does this. There's kind of a play here that kind of seems to be emerging where Google as an advertising platform has always just been like, it will get you to, I'll get this user to your website. And then from that point on, it's you. But it does seem like the conversion point is no longer like landing page. It's now point of sale, where if the agent can get you to click a button, I mean, Perplexity is even making the same play too, where if they can say like, buy now, and you don't have to think too much about like actually traversing the website, selecting options, whatever, they're in a decent spot to keep their same sort of like ethos just more directly on like where they're actually providing value, right? If the agentic system saying, I'm no longer going to land in your website and give you ad clicks, rather I'm going to land in your website and give you purchases, the value proposition is still generally directionally the same, but still works in an agentic era,
Yep. I
which
think
is interesting.
I think the key difference there though is that the middleman, i.e. Google or any other affiliate, is no longer necessary, right? If
Mm-hmm.
the agent's going directly to the point of sale, you're kind of bypassing all of this kind of middle layer that
Mm-hmm.
used to exist in the current, or I guess still does exist in the current infrastructure, right? Like I say that I
Well,
want to,
yeah. What I'm saying is
but
like in this circumstance, like Google's announcing stuff like this Project Mariner and all these other little things where that experience will be brought to the Google search blurb. So like if people are used to Google searching for like I don't know why like who's an artist? Give me an art Tame Impala. If there's a Tame Impala concert like somewhere in Colorado and I'm saying like Tame Impala tickets Colorado, the blurb might change instead of like redirect me to Ticketmaster. Then I browse the Ticketmaster page and select stuff. It's there's tickets for $85 in like row H. Buy, you click it. Google already has your bank information, and all of a sudden they're the affiliate that matters. There's no worry about the middleman. They just have a relationship with Ticketmaster, whoever it is, to get value out of the fact that they converted for them.
yeah, I think so. Under that paradigm, I think I agree completely. I guess the paradigm that I'm thinking more about is something where not looking for an experience, maybe
Mm-hmm.
something that is like by definition unique, right? Specific seats at a concert, right? Or something like
Mm-hmm.
this, but it was rather something that you would be buying and maybe considering multiple options. Like I want to buy a new pair of headphones and I
Yeah.
don't know if I want to do it at Costco or Best Buy or Amazon or whatever. And
Mm-hmm.
so now the button that I get one click pointed to in
Yeah.
that blurb is going to matter. And maybe what ends
Yeah.
up happening, and I could see this also, is I guess one of two things, really, both of which of these two scenarios would be good for Google. Number, maybe good, maybe bad, but possibly good. The first might be that what you get in almost all of those things is consolidation, in that it becomes very difficult for a relatively unknown brand to be
Mm-hmm.
featured on Google. And they're going to have to find clicks somewhere else, i.e., social media, which largely happens to a degree
Yeah.
anyway. But basically, all you're going to have on Google, to maybe your point, is just the sponsored links. And
Yeah.
it's going to be the highest bidder for I want to buy these concert tickets. Am I going to StubHub or SeatGeek or Ticketmaster?
Yeah.
And whoever's first is just simply the highest bidder on Google. And again, for Google, that may just be just as profitable because what you end up doing there is you end up in a purely margin based, almost 100% margin business
Yeah.
there, where you just have a bid in the more traditional sense. You don't need this algorithmic bidding
Yeah.
for real time. You just say who's going to pay me the most to be the agentic one click button.
Yep. Yeah, even with the like let's assume I don't know if Google's supporting like these traditional like browser scraping, hopping things. Obviously, they would have the infrastructure to do so. But in a world where they are, and let's say like you search for Tame Impala tickets and you maybe care about what your vendor is, even that circumstance, if it is live crawling the internet and picking out options for you, Google also is the one of the few companies in the space, like one of the few big ones between OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google, that they're focusing on generative UI. Like they have a precedent for it in Notebook LLM, where you input materials and it's able to generate abstracted visuals and interactive elements, right? That's not a behavior that's baked into ChatGPT or baked into Claude. And so in that universe, it kind of makes sense that like, if you're trying to do like an options comparison or something, right? If you want to say like, you know how there's like apps that show you like flight time or like flight
Yeah.
price changes. If you want to do that in ChatGPT, what ChatGPT would do is go ahead and like run like a data analysis system, like write a Python script based on the data it finds, then produce that graph for you that you can click on and look at. Kind of goofy, not like intuitive, not simple. Whereas I would kind of see Google going down that lane of like that search blurb converts into search blurb plus generative UI that's able to showcase data or images or like render interactive stuff, that even those can have clickable ads or purchase points on them,
Yeah.
which would make a lot of sense as to where they're trying to go, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I think in summary, there is no shortage of demand for consumer attention.
Yeah.
So somebody is going to win kind of the online search marketplace battle. It may be Google, it'd be somebody else, but I think you're right. Independent of who wins, we are fundamentally going to see a new marketplace because
Yeah.
what is going to be presented with both, I think both the humans and and agents working on humans' behalf is that list of action buttons instead. And it may, and to your point, it may come with the form of price changes for flights or a seating chart for the tickets that you want to search for the concert, whatever it is. It may become dynamic and interactive. And in fact, this is a fairly interesting tangent because some people are working. I don't have the names immediately come into memory here, but some people are working on this idea that all UI becomes dynamic. So rather than kind of loading the page as it stays standard loading, kind of in like an extreme version of JavaScript, right? Because like a lot of these things are just presenting JSON objects, right, in some sort of like structured display table, those kind of things, where it's like human readable. And so you could imagine a world that is kind of the way you're describing on demand UI and UXs that are kind of purposely built, but also purposely stochastic to be hyper specific to the user and use case they're kind of currently looking for.
Yeah. There's beyond Google, I mean, this is kind of just like a flat announcement to me. Like I don't know what most people are thinking about this, what they're doing with it. Claude 4, we got a major version bump. Apparently it's one of the best coding models on the market. Anthropic has always been. But it's now out there and pumping out systems. They have both instant response and they have thinking for deeper reasoning. The market's kind of getting crowded. I feel like, I mean, it's always been kind of sort of saturated. These announcements are getting a little bit more and more boring over time since '01. But both Gemini and Claude announced new models. Both of them are fairly good at coding. If you have other thoughts, hit them. But otherwise, I feel like this is kind of dead, to be honest.
So my only thought is more in the abstract, and that's I think for all of the known use cases, these model announcements do land pretty blah. Right?
Yeah.
Like agentic coding is already a thing. Agentic coding is already pretty good. It's not perfect and it's going to get incrementally better. But these benchmark scores don't really allude to that, right? Instead of the error rate being 80%, if the success rate being 80%, if it becomes 82%, humans probably aren't even going to notice that, to be honest. But what excites me every time this happens is number one, it just continues to reinforce the idea that like a more competitive environment and ecosystem will continue to incentivize these other companies to push this technology forward. And as someone who really likes this technology and really wants to see it continue to get really good, I'm all for that.
Yeah.
Also, personally, every time there's a new model release, things that weren't previously possible now have the possibility to be possible, if that makes sense. And so I'm simply just more plainly, every time there's a model release, there's a chance that never before possible things can be done. That's kind of where I'm getting at. And so like I don't know what Claude 4 can do that any other model can't, and maybe the answer is nothing. But the reality is every time something comes out, there's at least a new chance, right? And so like that to me is exciting, not specific to the model or even any of the companies, but again, exciting for the emergent capabilities overall.
Yeah, one thing, I mean, outside of the actual model capability itself, so like for example, coding just seems to be where all of these models are oriented towards on adding value. But the software engineer benchmark, like the ones that that just like how good are you at solving engineering coding tasks. I believe 3.7 was at like a 70% on that benchmark. 4 is at a 80%.
Yep.
So like approaching pretty good. Again, not enough to be like, whoa, like knock your socks off, like we're at 99 or something. But at least significant. But even in that lane, a related announcement from both OpenAI and Claude, both in a similar capacity. OpenAI has announced Codex being generally available. I don't know where I find that. I've been struggling to find that. And Claude also made Claude Code generally available. What that means is it's natively integrated into GitHub. So it can make PRs for you. Like you can just chat in the UI, have it update code, try things, all that sort of stuff. I don't know where Devin has been in the modern day, but obviously this is a lot of what Devin was trying to be. But this sort of like there's all these announcements of model changes and all this sort of stuff are being paired with UX changes about ChatGPT natively can connect to your GitHub. Claude Code can be integrated into your GitHub. You can try these apps too, which is something that feels like it's getting more and more competitive. Google doesn't really have a space in it, but I know like this is also a big announcement. Microsoft Copilot also went open source this past week.
Mm-hmm.
So we're seeing a lot of shifting again, like leveling up power to the big players in the coding space as well.
Yeah, so two thoughts. I want to do the open source thoughts second, but just first on the kind of UI change. I agree it's happening. To me, it kind of feels like Cursor nailed it. Cursor slash Windsurf nailed it. And like what I really need when I'm coding, right, is an IDE. And connecting to GitHub is kind of already a solved problem. Like, yeah, you need a couple of like terminal commands or like, CLI, prompts, but it really is kind of fixed. I mean, again, I think using GitHub as a central um, connection point makes perfect sense for the coding, and like why not be able to write code in the Claude UI as well as do it on kind of a desktop, cursor app or something similar. I think that's really smart. The thing that I've been doing to accelerate some of my coding experience is asking questions in the Claude UI about my code base while I'm also having cursor probably using the Claude
Mm,
API help me code directly. Right. So
yeah.
it's kind of like things like how can I, as an example, having cursor actually write the code, but having Claude in the UI help me plan how to make my data fetching more like pipeline efficient. I'm trying to get a large set of data. How do I do that more efficiently than my current code base? So copy paste current relevant code files into Claude and ask it to kind of make a plan of how it could reconfigure that code or restructure it such that I'm batch processing or kind of otherwise. And so if there is a more streamlined way to do that to where I can kind of interact with a central point, i.e. GitHub, both from both those interfaces, I think it kind of makes sense. But that has diminishing returns in the sense of like, I'm not going to use five, right? I'm going to use Cursor and Claude, and that's
Yeah.
probably it. Maybe ChatGPT, but that's pretty much it.
Yeah, it's changing a lot. I feel like basically like this past week, everyone announced like we now have a deep research tool in our system. We now
Yeah.
have a code tool in our system, and it's becoming kind of beyond just the typical distribution game of like how do you get people to love your tool more. And there's so many cohorts of like who is there to attract love from. It's getting very I don't know. Saturated's not the full word of what I'm trying to capture. Like, there's something about just like the uniformity of it that I think is like not getting solved for well. Like, the innovation space is like moving so rapidly that every single innovation feels less impressive to me
Yep.
almost.
Yep.
And so, like, we'll see on what ends up happening. I think like there's another moment coming up that's kind of waiting on like new big app form discovery. Like MCP kind of did that for a while, and MCP and Claude are kind of deeply related in that way. But kind of going beyond that to saying we have a new format out in there in the world that's actually changing beyond like chat generates an output or speaks to a server. Something that kind of captures imaginations again, because right now it feels like it's getting a little stale almost.
I want to go back to the open source discussion because I want to get your thoughts on some things here. So I'm going to lay out kind of like a general thesis that I don't think I fully believe in, but I think is largely where my thoughts are
Mhm.
on it. And then I kind of want to get your reaction. So you mentioned Copilot going open source. Open source to me, especially when you make the transition from closed source to open source, is a little bit of an internal admission that
Mhm.
we're not the best at this, and we
Mhm.
don't necessarily want to be the best at this, and then therefore we will leave it up to the open source community to make advancements where our attention isn't. And that's
Mhm.
not to say that like they couldn't be capable, but none of the greatest companies in the world, none of the really even the good companies in the world do everything. Right.
Yeah.
They usually pick a lane. They usually are very good at what they are very good at. And then they deliver exceptional experience and value down that particular lane.
Mhm.
And that lane may be multi-lane in the case of Google or Microsoft, where it's, the Teams package, it's the Microsoft Office, or it's YouTube and the Google search or whatever. So it can be kind of multi-lane, but in any event, it can't be every lane. Like very few companies, if any ever, can kind of be the everything app. I
Mhm.
think it's one of the things that, Musk gets wrong about the X thing. I don't think people want that much in one package. I think they kind of like the kind of separation, the delegation of these various things to various people. So I guess the question directly to you is what's your overall take on open source, closed source? Do you similarly see it to me as, this is kind of them saying Copilot is not going to be our primary focus, and we're very happy to, have the open source community contributing to this project because they may stumble on things that we would have otherwise overlooked or not done.
I kind of look at it as the opposite, I think, where I think the Copilot stuff has proven that like they're just copying so many moves in so many capacities. Like, agentic mode was probably the like cursor's innovation more than anything, and agentic mode has bled over to Copilot. Where in a lot of circumstances, I'm sure there are like big, large F500 companies who look at Copilot versus Cursor, but because the delta of what those two things do has kind of converged, if Copilot does them worse, like it's a more obvious buying decision to buy from Microsoft than is Cursor as a company, right? And by going open source, I don't think it's like a admission of defeat. I think if anything, it's like a let the developer enthusiastic coding community bring their ideas to our platform. Like if there is a way that like startup or like raw developer innovation lands in Copilot, it's not going to be like a project manager at Microsoft saying we need these XYZ features after I did 3 months of research. Now we're going to take 7 months to implement. Instead, it's, hey, Cursor released this thing. I'm going to make a PR into Microsoft Copilot saying I want this also similar mode up. Once people review, that feature is now in there, right? It's an innovation delta that I think ends up being more favorable for Microsoft. I don't know what ends up doing relationship wise with OpenAI and Windsurf. Obviously, Windsurf also started open source, and I mean, I think they are still open source. I haven't used
I mean,
Windsurf intentionally,
yeah.
but in that sort of lane, there are two open source projects used. One of which is already a fork from Copilot or from VS Code anyway. You're just kind of bubbling up to Copilot can be the dominant coding IDE if it wants to. If it's unreined from like, if it's like unsaddled from the matter of like, then like long-term planning cycles and KPIs and annual plannings, I think it's more free to play the startup game. I think being open source allows that almost.
Yeah, I mean, to clarify, I think we're actually in agreement. I think we're saying the same things. I'm not saying that the transition from closed source to open source is admitting defeat. If anything, I think it's just saying that we don't exactly know where this product is headed, and
Mhm.
instead we want to serve this to the developer community that can help us. It
Yeah.
takes out the kind of user research aspect,
Yeah.
which I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
you laid out really well. Which again, I agree. Meaning, like the core expertise of exactly where to take this doesn't fall under the domain knowledge of the company, the parent entity.
Yeah.
Therefore, we will put this to the open source community and kind of see what interesting and creative things they come up with.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the overall like ecosystem moving towards open source makes a lot of sense insofar as if your developers are your most excited users and they're the ones printing out material, like open source allows you to skip a lot of product work hypothetically.
Yeah.
Like you avoid the need for product work because if you have an actual community on your tool and they like to engage with it and have opinions on it, they can drive your development and drive your direction, you just need to moderate it ever so slightly and make sure it's just aligned with company values and all that sort of stuff. But once you have that, um, all of a sudden your product is almost like self-producing, which is kind
Yeah.
of nice.
Yeah,
That's clever.
I think, as you know, we've been living this cycle as well. But knowing what to build is often the more difficult and important
Hmm.
question than how to build or if you can build something,
Yeah,
right? I mean, especially in software, a lot of the problems that you need to know or that you need to address rather to deliver a solution are solvable problems, right? I mean, very very few people are actually dealing with problems on the absolute cutting edge of software, right? Having to
yeah,
really innovate either, new architectures or languages or algorithms or whatever. I mean, people are kind of stitching things, already known solutions together, but knowing what to build and who to build it for is very challenging. And so I think
Yeah.
one of the advantages that you're articulating and correctly pointing out is that by kind of just submitting something to the open source community, they're just in effect
Yeah.
crowdsourcing ideas, like crowdsourcing the kind of what to build, which I think is again really, really smart.
Yeah, I do wonder. I mean, obviously, part of the incentive of open source is that like you're able to use these tools without paying or like without like having to get the official enterprise license on them. I do wonder how much people are actually like. I wonder how a startup founder who's in the coding space is looking at this thing. You know, like, are we seeing an uptick in I'm going to make a coding IDE versus a downtrend all of a sudden because Copilot's going to absorb all this open source traffic that's going to make innovation for them really, really easy. Why would I compete there?
It's an interesting question. I don't know. I really don't. I mean, I think we've speculated a little bit, or maybe even a lot, over previous episodes about kind of on the observation that coding seems to be the place where these large language models are delivering real value in the
Mm-hmm.
present day, both in terms of people getting real use out of them on a daily basis, and also kind of the primary revenue drivers for anybody that's kind of making a large language model company, or
Yeah.
like the most successful companies have been kind of wrapper companies, so to
Mm-hmm.
speak, but that are wrapping the large language models in some sort of coding something, whether it be an
Yeah.
IDE or, like a V0 or a Replit kind of, text to code, design software, if
Yeah.
you will. And so I don't know. I think human creativity and the ability to create, I think, or the affinity to create rather, will sustain. And I think that one of the questions I've been thinking about a lot recently, especially with the release of like 4.1, whenever that was, about a month ago now or so,
Yeah.
design iteration isn't solved yet. And I'm
Mm.
wondering if there's an IDE kind of, and maybe Figma does this and I just don't know it, but like what I really want in the same way that I can have agentic code generation, but then I
Mm-hmm.
can take over at any point and just write the code myself, right? Or just go in and edit single characters or whatever. It becomes completely granular and incredibly modular post. You can't do that currently with any of the image generation or that kind of tooling in like Dolly, right? So if I have Dolly that's running under ChatGPT, make me something, I can do it and I can prompt it, but it again tries to one shot the entire image, just
Yeah.
building on the context of the image it already created and my newest prompt.
Yeah.
Right. What I really want to do is I want to go move pixels around
Yeah.
individually, right? Or the thing that it gets wrong all the time basically is text. It'll
Yeah.
misspell a word, it'll put a comma where a period needs to be, it'll do things like that. Those are very solved
Mm-hmm.
problems if you're using a traditional designing software, right?
Yeah.
Figma or Adobe Illustrator
Photoshop. Yeah.
or exactly any of those things. Right? You can literally move those things on a pixel by pixel basis. So one of the things I was thinking about, I guess yesterday, was what would it look like if you went text to image, but the image was fully vectorized in a way that as soon as the image was created, you could
Mm.
move it pixel by pixel in the same way that you do in Photoshop or in
Yeah.
Illustrator or something like that. And I'm sure I'm not the only person thinking about this, and I'm sure there's
Mm.
something obvious for why that isn't possible, but it still occurs to me that AI isn't 100% good, and it probably never will be 100% good, just like humans. And the
Yeah.
more fine or granular you can get on the editing process to where you can have a human come in and polish in a way that isn't a band-aid, right? You can slap that
Yeah.
image somewhere else. You can band-aid it with like
Yeah.
a brick or, a block or whatever, and then like put text over it. But like that's not the same as kind of going in and changing a pixel in the
Like the
same way that you
AI
can
is
kind of
able to
go
do
in.
the minor revision
Yeah,
polish
yeah,
step.
yeah. Or even just giving it to humans in a way that allows them to modify at the base level,
I see.
not at the completed level, right?
I
Like
see.
you can
Yeah.
code.
Yeah.
After your cursor agent spits out a new file, you can then go back in and change any of the text in that file to make it do what you want to do. If you know that, as an example, it put a period where a comma should be,
Yeah.
or a semicolon where a colon should be, you can just go in and edit that yourself. You don't have
Yeah.
to then prompt the AI and say, no, go to line X, change this semicolon.
Yeah. Yeah, the it's an interesting premise. I feel like you just end up in this weird mix of like what diffusion models fundamentally are, where diffusion models have proven to be like the best at doing any given task, but their kind of design is like I know the area I need to diffuse into. And so when I'm doing this generation, like I have no concept of layers or vector equations or the sort of stuff you have in like Illustrator or whatever have you,
Yep.
where things have bounding
Yep.
rules, right? Like Photoshop, like as an app, I'm sure that a lot of people are like AI in Photoshop has replaced a lot of work. We're just simply being able to like drag your box around, like change this section to look like this, or generate an image that looks like this. Like you kind of get the sort of experience you're describing, but it's very different from like a ChatGPT offering that sort of tool, right?
Yeah.
It's still meant for a Photoshop technical user who knows
Yeah.
like what a lasso select is and like how to interact with like the temperature and bleed and whatever
Mhm.
to still manage their workspace really, really intelligently. Um,
Yeah.
so I
I
don't
think
know.
the bigger abstract idea that I would just like your download on
Mhm.
is not, let me ask this in a slightly more maybe thought-provoking way. If we assume that humans are going to be interacting with agents as default behavior for some
Mhm.
timeline in the future, 2 years, 10 years, doesn't matter. Agents will be able to read code
Yes.
more naturally than anything humans produce. Images, written word, doesn't matter.
Yep.
Speech, text, doesn't matter. Are all of the communications going to communications and collateral, and so in this case, images, video, etc., going to pass through code? And if so, does it actually make more sense rather than trying to make Photoshop, make something that is code base first? So kind
Mhm.
of write it to SVG, be able to manipulate the SVG in kind of a GUI that would be
Yep.
kind of like Photoshop or alternatively, but what you're actually doing rather than just moving a pixel from one spot in an XY coordinate to a different one, you're actually
Mhm.
fundamentally rewriting the code that
Yep.
produces that SVG
Yeah.
graphic while you're doing it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think I think the way we've seen these models train in general has been like, I guess the where the models have been trained most successfully has been text to text in whatever capacity, right? And we've begun to see pixel to text to pixel, all that sort of stuff. Pixel to math is an interesting one. Like
Yep.
you and I have tried this a number of times, like generating HTML for XYZ task or like generate a logo. When you ask Claude to generate a logo, it will try its hand at SVG. And I've
Yep.
generally found that sucks. It's really,
Yep.
really bad. Where I
Yep.
would probably prefer to just like take a raw Photoshop thing, draw it up myself, and then dump it into somewhere else and maybe give the pieces, right?
Yep.
Um, it's an interesting premise to assume that like all the AI does is produce code. I mean, every file is just some collection of binary, right?
Yep.
Where if the AI is able to produce the correct binary for a given file type, you have the image, or you have the
Yep.
SVG, or you have the
Yep.
Word doc, whatever.
Yep.
I just think it's not being right now. It's not convenient to the consumer to spend time on that angle, but it is an interesting one. I think
Yeah.
you end up in a lot of complications where like you have to make a lot of assumptions about the ecosystem generally. Where like binary represents a lot of unlabeled nothing, and you can always tell like what the truth of a binary field is, right? If I have a binary string and I know it's a docx type, the docx type tells me how to decode that
Yes.
binary into the document I care
Yes.
about, right? But that's like it's an interesting assumption I think to make about like in the same way MCP generalizes how you talk to an API. I would imagine you need to change the developer ecosystem and the consumer ecosystem such that connecting to the binary is something that's very natively intuitive,
Do
right?
you do you, I don't disagree with any of that. Do you see it as fundamentally different though in the transition from purely a command line interface into a graphical user interface?
I don't think so. I think it's just like the matter of like delivery of that system is something that is diffusion models are always going to be faster at generating a quality image than a system deciding the lines and vectors it needs, right?
Could you not just band-aid? Yeah, again, no opposition to that statement. Could you not just band-aid? And again, I'm purely in a brainstorm scenario. That I'm
Mhm.
sure there's some kind of silliness baked in here, but could you not just then hypothetically take the output of the diffusion model and convert that into code?
Until it would become like a PNG in this
Yeah,
case, like it would become an
yeah.
SVG, like an
So,
editable
something that
thing.
something
Yeah,
something that could ultimately be edited pixel by pixel by a
yeah,
human or by a
yeah,
secondary agent or something.
yeah. Like I think if you're kind of making this assumption about like we want like a editing friendly IDE, the problem that you end up in is the iteration cycle between so like trusting an LLM to produce an SVG for me. I know an LLM can produce an SVG. Like it can output a file that has vectorized linear equations that define how my picture looks. I can download that. But to get the LLM to then do like in the same way Cursor says like, hey, you've produced code, I'm linting it. Hey, I see there's an error in where I put the linting. Let me go back and fix that. Or I made a variable reference that doesn't exist. Let me fix that, right? The iteration cycle right now between I'm going to produce a bunch of equations that I'm going to generate the output image, have an LM vision model revise how that looks based on what the user prompted me with, and go back and revise the equations. Right now, I don't know that I would trust first without a different protocol change. Let's say it's a picture of you or me, right? Like we're both very complicated figures. Like to make a linear equation that looks like us would mean like probably hundreds of thousands of equations to create something that barely resembles our silhouette, right? In that universe, you're trusting the LM to generate those equations in a way that's like fairly intelligently labeled, right? It might be like, this is Lakshay's right nose like curvature or something. And if it says like, I'm looking at the picture, I'm looking at the thing I generated, I can see the right nose curvature looks off. I'm going to go hunt my code and see where that linear equation is. And all of a sudden now that's retrievable, editable, and I'm able to go back. I don't trust right now that like math to visual is something that would map super well in a way that's actually functional. And that the cycle of iteration, like the vision model providing feedback, would be fast enough for anyone to prefer that over a diffusion model effectively. The diffusion models already take long enough, right? Like it's like 2 minutes to generate an image versus like this, where like if I were to say like make a picture of Damon, it'd probably be like 500 like hours and then some revision after the fact and correction during.
Yeah. I guess my only comment is to that is at the end of that diffusion process, even if it does take hours or minutes, will be more likely. So long as I can move things pixel by pixel, I'm happy with it. The problem that I have right now is that I run a diffusion process. It takes a minute or whatever, and then something is wrong, usually a minor error in it. And then I want to change it again. So now I have to rerun the entire diffusion process over again, with now a bigger context window because it has that image that it just generated in it again and again and again. And I'm kind of like continuously one-shotting, this process. Whereas what I really want is just the ability to take what it's given me and edit it pixel by pixel in a way that is better than band-aiding it in, Illustrator or Photoshop or whatever. And again, this is like certainly I'm not a designer, nor am I anyone who uses many of these tools other than just making grass look pretty ever. So this is not really I'm not the ideal user for this, but I was having the thought, I guess really the more abstract and I think interesting question here is, if we assume that the common language between humans and agents is code, does it actually make far more sense to just assume that everything is going to be code at some point? All communication channel like arrives back at some, like you're saying, some set of ones and zeros that we can interconnect with.
Cool.
Great. Okay. Well, that's a great place to end. So thanks everybody for joining us for this week's episode of the ScholarAI Founders Pod. Reminder to catch us on your typical podcast locations and find us on our YouTube channel. See you all next week.